So maybe connected to this point, and then we'll move on to talking a little bit about the hidden tribe study, which I know you worked on very significantly. Just in the social sciences, and this maybe kind of closes the loop on academia and the sort of the types of biases that exist. I know there are different streams of research in the social sciences. So you operate in a very quantitative, evidence-based manner, but you're probably also familiar with the infamous James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian experiment and the SoCal experiment, where it seems like peer-reviewed social science journals were looking for, I guess, a combination of certain buzzwords or ideas that sounded like something that their ideological agenda was in line with. And they ended up publishing these articles, even though they were self-admitted nonsense by the authors. You publish in very reputable journals like Nature and others. How clear is the line among serious social scientists between the, let's say, more scientific, more quantitative style research and the more, I don't know what you would call it, maybe more activist research?
Yeah, that's a great question. So from my perspective, it's extremely clear. There are scientific journals, and then there are, what you might call critical or theoretical journals that are really, my understanding of the references that are the instances that you're talking about, they don't involve, for example, data collection. They don't involve data analysis. They don't involve any sort of scientific endeavor whatsoever. And so I think, scientists would probably venture to say that one of the reasons in which these types of things are able to flourish outside of science is because of the sort of lack of potential rigor. And that's, I think, from a scientific perspective, one of the reasons why we prioritize these methods, because it acts as a bulwark against the type of kind of linguistic obfuscation that might happen in these journals that could then lead for total BS to get published in a journal. So the line is very clear from a scientific perspective. I can't comment on, within my understanding is that, again, these were in the sort of like the critical theory world. I actually don't know in the world of philosophy and critical theory whether there are journals that would be considered. I'm sure there's journals that are considered very reputable and less so. But exactly how bright that line is not something I'm familiar with, because it's just a sort of another solar system away from me.
Right. Okay, so bring it to the social sciences, and I really appreciate when social scientists at least try to bring the data, have that rigor, have definitional clarity, and when you can sort of really follow the results, and the results kind of mean something. And of course, you can always poke holes in the methodology, but at least there's a transparency as to what the methodology was, and so you can kind of look at the whole. You look at a study as a whole and be a little bit more intellectually engaged with it. And that was definitely the case with the Hidden Tribe study that you worked with More in Common. Absolutely fantastic study that I always talk about and think about in the context of the culture war and political polarization. So just very quickly, for people who don't know, so there's kind of the extremes, right? Which the study calls the wings, right? You've got around 8% on the left that are considered a wing, about 25% on the right. And then 2/3 of people are part of what the study calls an exhausted majority in the middle. And they tend to hold views that are less extreme, less in stark black and white opposition with one another. They tend to be, interestingly, more ethnically diverse also than the wings. Right. The wings tend to be more Caucasian.
Yep.
And also more open to compromise and nuance and so on and so forth. And it casts a very interesting lens on the culture war and how common ground is obscured by politicians and pundits who play this kind of like selective game designed to produce outrage and clicks, but end up kind of feeding the polarization, and we end up going in circles in these discussions as opposed to kind of solving something. So when you get really down to the specifics, one aspect of the study that I loved is when it broke down how much common ground there is in America around very, very pragmatic issues that are supposed to be contentious. So I have just a few examples here. 81% of Americans believe that racism is at least a somewhat serious problem. So 81%. This is not something that only people on the left believe. 75% think that there should be a pathway for the children of illegal immigrants to gain citizenship through, for instance, serving in the military or attending college. So again, this is not something that everybody on the right is against. Not true. 80% believe that political correctness has gone too far. So presumably would include a lot of people on the left. And 85% think that race should not be a factor in college admissions. So whenever I cite these statistics to people, they end up being really shocked. Are you sure? And like, yeah, I'm pretty sure their methodology was pretty rigorous and pretty well done. You'll never hear anything about this in the media and on like the culture war channels. And this in many ways points to the hidden consensus in this kind of the political zeitgeist, which is divisiveness and conflict are almost ends in themselves. They're kind of engineered to be part of the public discourse. So I know you were a senior director of research for More in Common as part of the study. You've got kind of an insider's view of all of this. What are some of the key things that you've learned from the study and what it tells us about the culture war that we're living in? Yeah,
well, great questions, and I appreciate you bringing those key points up. So I have a couple things that I wanted to point out here. One thing, so in reference to this idea that there is an incentive to create a sense of polarization, the journalist Amanda Ripley came up with this term that she calls conflict entrepreneurs, which I think is such an apt idea. You know, it's this idea that we have many people in our society, politicians, certain people on social media, on other forms of media, certain business leaders and others have an incentive to both create the appearance of polarization and to actually foment greater polarization. This can be because, you know, when you rile people up, when you get them angry, when you get them outraged, when you get them feeling as though there's this other enemy within the country that's trying to take down or is representing a threat to your way of life, and you get people to really engage. You get more clicks, you get more attention, you get people sharing. We've found there's tons of studies on social media that shows that negative tweets that foster a sense of outrage and in particular moral, what my colleague Billy Brady calls moral emotional words, things that have an emotional component to them and a moral component to them. Those are the concepts and ideas that are most likely to get amplified in the social media context. And there's a whole set of incentives that's sort of embedded in our society right now that's actually serving to further propagate these kinds of behaviors, because it ends up being to people's actual benefit to do them. So that's one sort of key takeaway that I've come away with. And then there's the brighter side of the story. The brighter side of the story is that we do have this exhausted majority. We do have a group of people that represents 2/3 of the American population that's really just exhausted with the constant fighting, the constant lack of ability to make progress on shared concerns and challenges. And in addition, these people tend to be less active on political and social channels. They're less likely to share political content on social media. They're less necessarily informed about, they're not glued to the TV screen trying to figure out what's going on. They've kind of tuned it out because it's just so overwhelming and so exhausting for them. And so this is the group of, and you know, although I'm not super familiar with the situation in Canada, I wouldn't be surprised if a similar dynamic was taking place there as well. So this is the group of people that I think we need to be paying more attention to. This is the group of people we need to be listening to. And that's part of the work, part of my work, in other contexts, partly in the academic sphere, has been to start to better to listen better to these types of people and to try to understand what their concerns are. What are the kinds of issues that they're dealing with in their daily lives? What are the things that they're concerned with? Where do they want to see the country going? And so those types of questions are I think the most important for, eventually moving to a place where we can heal our divides and actually make progress on some of the most important issues that we're facing right now.
Yeah, really good points. You also wrote about how there's a perception gap. So at the extremes, people on the right will have certain caricatures of the left, and people on the left will have caricatures of people on the right. It's almost like those distorted mirrors at the circus. And so you're addressing the caricature. But then when you read a study like The Hidden Tribes, and you see the diversity of views that exists within the left and within the right, and I think if people became aware of this, there would be a little bit more optimism, just because the extremes are not quite as, they're overrepresented in social media, in even mainstream media, and more in the political regime. They're overrepresented. They're extremely loud. They're very organized, but the reality is quite different. So what do you think of this kind of perception gap? And we almost, if you self-identify as more friendly to the right, you have a very, very predictable caricature of the left. And if you're on the left, you have this very predictable caricature on the right. And so more and more discourse is aimed at these caricatures as opposed to the actual population and what most people actually believe.
Yeah, it is exactly right. So just to kind of fill in some of the details there. So after we conducted Hidden Tribes, so one of the things I actually wanted to point out about, circle back and just point out about Hidden Tribes, one of the key characteristics of the Hidden Tribes that I think makes it different from other studies that have been done on the political landscape is we were really focusing on what we call core beliefs. So these are the underlying psychological worldviews that sort of define people's core values. So these are things like their views about agency and personal responsibility, their views about their moral values, how much they value things like loyalty and fairness, how much how their sense of threat, their parenting style, and their group identities. So these are the kinds of core beliefs that we use when we created this, what we call the segmentation process, which essentially is aimed at taking what is perceived to be a very binary system. You have red, you have blue, you have liberals versus Democrats, right? And what we're doing is we actually, through this segmentation process, we're identifying groups of people who are similar in their core beliefs. And then those are what we call the hidden tribes. And they're hidden, of course, because it's not necessarily that demographic factors like age or race or even geography are the things that are separating and defining these groups. It's actually their underlying approach and understanding of the world around them that are defined by these core beliefs. So that is sort of like part of the process that we undertook there, and it identified these 7 different tribes ranging from progressive activists on the left all the way to devoted conservatives on the right, and then a variety of different groups in the middle. Now, after we did that study, we started getting this sense that not only are these wing groups, the very small percentages of people on the sides of the political spectrum, not only are they animated by a deep conviction in the rightness of their own worldviews, they're also animated by a deep-seated sense that they are fighting an existential battle against their political opponents on the other side. And so we started wondering, like, what is contributing to this dynamic? Where is this coming from? So we ran this study that we ended up calling the perception gap study. And it was actually very simple. We simply asked Democrats, a variety of questions about what they thought. We asked them to make a prediction about what Republicans believed on a variety of issues, ranging from immigration to racism to our beliefs about how we teach our history and the history of the country and the Constitution. So Democrats guessed what Republicans thought and how they answered these questions, and then Republicans actually answered the questions. Similarly, we asked a bunch of Republicans to guess how Democrats would respond to a variety of questions, and then we asked the Democrats to actually respond to them. And so what this allowed us to do was to create a score that represented the difference between what I actually think the other side believes and what they actually believe. And this is what we call the perception gap. And it turns out so a number of kind of really interesting things come from this study. First of all, people are wildly off base in terms of how they think what they think their opponents actually believe. Democrats think that most Republicans deny that racism still exists as a problem in America, for example. Republicans think that Democrats want America to be a socialist country. They think that Republicans think that most Democrats think that most police are bad people. They think that that Democrats want to deny the teaching of history, and that they think that the founding fathers are all bad people. These kinds of things. And so, first of all, we just find that there's just wild inaccuracies from both parties about what the other side actually believes. Not only that, but we find that a number of counterintuitive findings with regards to what leads people to be, or what is associated with greater inaccuracy or accuracy in these kinds of contexts. So, for example, the more you watch the news, the more inaccurate you are about what your political opponents believe. The more educated you are.
Predictable, but wow. Predictable, but wow.
Predictable, but wow, right? Yeah, that was the same reaction we had. We were like, yeah, okay, but also damn. The more educated, so this is an interesting one. Going back to this question about universities, we find that the higher degrees of education lead to more inaccuracy, but only for Democrats. So Republicans,
of course,
there's no relationship between education and inaccuracy. Highly educated Republicans are just as inaccurate as Democrats. But Democrats, the more years of education and the more time they've had in the American universities, the more inaccurate they are about their political opponents. We speculate this is because universities are, of course, notoriously left-leaning, and so you're actually spending less and less time with people that you disagree with. And we actually find that this is the case, that people's friend groups, for example, as they spend more and more time in universities, people on the left, their friend groups become less and less politically diverse, more and more homogenous from a viewpoint perspective.
That's very interesting, Daniel, on this particular point. So I have a lot of friends in academia, a lot of friends like senior academics. And, we all started off like more or less similar in terms of political views. But as they've kind of crafted a career in academia, I've noticed the kind of thought police that they're, and I think they're aware of it too. Like when they talk to me, there's the kind of like the little confessions. It's almost like confession time. They can tell me because I'm a business owner, so it doesn't really matter, right? What I think. Yeah. But definitely their views have become more rigid and more. And I'm not surprised that doesn't apply to right-wing students, because I think pretty early on in their college career, they just get used to tuning out their professors, and they're like, yeah, whatever. Like, just like, I'm just going to believe what I believe. But I also wanted to ask you, statistically, who was more inaccurate about the other side? Was the right more inaccurate about the left, or was the left more inaccurate about the right?
Right. That's a great question. So I'm going to give you an unsatisfying answer to that. And that is that we actually don't know. And the reason is that that the questions that we asked each side were different. So we asked Republicans a certain set of questions about what they thought Democrats believed, and we asked Democrats a different set of questions about what Republicans believed. And the reason we chose different questions is that we wanted to tap into the sort of the most salient types of issues that each side was sort of dealing with at the time. And so while this allowed us to get a really good sense of the inaccuracies about both sides, it prohibited us from making a direct comparison, because any differences any comparison you make could easily be because of the different nature of the questions, as opposed to something inherent about the political party that we're talking about.
Got it. So if you took a mere quantitative approach to it, like how many questions you got wrong, you'd be losing too much information. You can't really make a comparison that way.
Right. And it wasn't about right or wrong, because it was a 100-point scale. So we said sort of, what percent of Democrats do you think believe that America should be a socialist country? And so Republicans slide the scale and they say 90% of Americans think that. We actually ask Democrats, we get an average of 50%. And so what we end up having is sort of a continuous measure of how accurate or inaccurate they are. And so, but this measure is not comparable from the other side, because we didn't ask the same question.
Got it. It's a really tough. So what you see in the perception gap study again is a muting and obscuring of the exhausted middle, and a kind of a reification of the wings. Right, each wing kind of addresses the other, but it's really just 33% of America talking to each other. Most of them white. They're the two most ethnically homogenous groups. The actual exhausted majority tends to be much more ethnically diverse, which I found was extremely interesting. But it's really tough, because I find this is like, I want to hear what you think about this, because now it's like, okay, like number one, how do we explain the emergence of this phenomenon? Number two, is there anything to be done? And so I have a theory on the emergence of the phenomenon. I have no idea what could be done. I think it's too big. I think it's a legitimate cultural phenomenon. In other words, it's like multi-generational. It's not something that just popped up recently. It's something that's got deep roots. And so there isn't like a law that you could pass, or I think it's like a social movement, or kind of a, I think it's going to take a long time to fix these particular issues. They're very profound cultural issues. But I almost see as the way we are today. So let's take social media as the dominant public forum where political discussions are occurring, and where people are agreeing, disagreeing, becoming famous, becoming influential, so on and so forth, more and more. And then you've got government, the world of government, right? In the world of social media, as you've rightly said, there is almost no upside to being the sort of centrist pragmatist and try to kind of propose concrete solutions. There is no upside whatsoever. It is outrage driven. It is moral panic driven. It is look at what the other side is doing. Oh my God, existential crisis. Boom, you get likes, you get clicks, you get sort of rewarded for that. So the incentives and the rewards are extremely powerful towards polarization and moral panic and so on and so forth. In the world of government, I would also claim that there is no upside to pragmatism. None. Let's say you and I are running for a seat. The seat is actually scarce. One of us is going to get it. One of us is not. It's a zero-sum game, okay? What benefit is there in me saying, well, you know what, Daniel actually has a couple of interesting ideas here and there. Hey, what can we do to actually solve the problem? No, I'm going to magnify your flaws. You're going to magnify my flaws. And as I think another factor that's fed into this is the growth of government, and how absolutely massive government is today compared to just a couple of generations ago. And so there is so much power available inside of government, and it affects power in the market, that whatever benefit there could have been to kind of a centrist, pragmatic approach has completely vanished. Now it's really about just getting that seat, getting that power, and you are not talking about a whole other scale of power. So in both the public side and it's almost like funny how it's almost like a prophetic. If you look at Plato's prediction of what would happen to democracies, almost prophetic when you look at it, right? The population's too fickle. Yeah. I was just going to say, you'll have to refresh my Plato. It's been a few years since I checked that out. So I'm curious. Very simple. To simplify his argument in the Republic is that he goes, the will of the people. He goes, the people are fickle. He goes, one day they're dieting, one day they're not, one day they're doing this, one day they think they're a philosopher, because they're too fickle. They're not educated enough to really be the driving force for decisions. He goes, and then the leaders are just the people that can convince the people. So very famous analogy, he says, they're not the best shipbuilders. They're just the people who can best convince non-shipbuilders that they are. So you get kind of like the salesman-y politician and the uneducated people, and that's what you get with democracy. That's Plato's argument.
The people can't be trusted. Yes, that's why you need the philosopher king, right?
That's why you need the philosopher king. That's right. Which raises a whole bunch of other problems. But when you look at his kind of breakdown of where democracy could go, if a people stops being accountable to their reality, to the truth, if they stop actually getting educated about the issues, if they start being too fickle in their opinions, then in a sense, that is the deepest corruption of democracy, because you can have a perfect procedural electoral system, right, with perfect no election fraud, nothing at all, but the system is corrupted from within, right? The will of the people is only as good as the quality of the decisions that the people are making.
Right. Well, so fascinating. I mean, I'm also reminded of a lot of the writings of the founding fathers, which they were also obsessed with these kinds of questions about, the perils and opportunities of self-government, right? Because that is the American experiment, right? The American experiment is an exercise in self-government. Can the citizens be entrusted with the power to make their own decisions about who should lead them, what types of laws should be passed, who their representatives are? That is the essence of the American experiment. And the founding fathers, it remains to be seen how long this type of experiment can last. The founding fathers thought about this constantly. Madison was writing about the tyranny of the majority, and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were talking about civic virtues. And this I think it connects actually to a lot of the thinking that I've been doing more recently. You began your comment by kind of thinking about solutions. What do we do? Where do we go from here? Given the state of affairs that we're in, we appear to be at this seemingly impossible situation where both in the public sphere on social media and in the political sphere, we have a set of incentives that is exacerbating polarization and sort of just kind of collapsing in on itself and getting the knots just getting tighter and tighter and tighter. How do we untangle that knot? And I'd love to hear. It sounded like you were about to propose some ideas that you had as a solution.
Yeah, no, I mean, personally, I find the kind of research that you're doing, that More in Common is doing, so really a data-driven, evidence-based social science, I think is one of the vectors of improvement and change. Because if people can just develop a more realistic theory of who the people are, right, you'll get away with a lot of this these caricatures, this turning the other side into vilifying the other side. We could more accurately define and see sort of very extreme activist groups on both the right and the left. And in my sense, they are the ones who should be muted, not the pragmatic majority, right?
Right.
And so it's not the will of the people now. It's that the entire public space is being dominated by extreme groups, and that's what polarization is bringing. So it's a true problem that, like, again, the solution is not democracy. The solution for me is, I mean, broadly speaking, like better forms of education. So less ideological, more data-driven, more rational, more pragmatic, more positive in the sense that we're more focused on actual concrete solutions to concrete problems than we are fitting within a pre-existing ideological framework. So that's why I'm so passionate about this study, about the work that More in Common do, about some of your work. I'm going to talk about some of your studies as well.
Yeah.
And that's why I want to I wanted to really identify this branch of social science more particularly, and really bring it into sharp distinction with the more ideological word salad version of social sciences, because I do feel that this can be spreading this work and people becoming more aware of this work could be part of the solution, at least. That's the hope.
Yeah, absolutely. I think social science has many tools at its disposal to sort of start to make progress on this. I think the first thing is just a commitment to truth and objectivity, which is already, more than you can say for a lot of people, and a lot of, groups out there where truth is sort of secondary. Science is truly committed to the pursuit of knowledge and that sort of pursuit of truth. We have to maintain we have to put that on a pedestal. We have to put truth on a pedestal, and science, I think, really is an important effort to do that. Another thing I think that you touched on, but I'll kind of expand on, is what social science can do, and what I think that we need to do is to continue better understanding the core values and the priorities of the people in this exhausted majority that we have identified. Because the people on the wings are taking up so much space, they're taking up so much of the oxygen in the room, it is an opportunity for social scientists to sort of raise up these middle voices and to say, look, actually, you guys don't represent the views of the people in a way. You're drowning out the voices of this reasonable middle. And so by doing through surveys, through focus groups, through other methods of data collection, we can start to really hear in their own words from these people who are not necessarily so active in the political conversation, to start to raise their voices up and hopefully amplify them in such a way that people start to understand that this is the true battle. The true battle is not between the left and the right, but the true battle is between the center and these wing groups that are trying to keep people divided. Yeah.
Totally agree. And I think one of the challenges is that the exhausted majority has been so turned off that they've almost like tuned out completely. And it's just like, this whole political thing is just cognitive overwhelm. Like, I just can't deal with it. I don't want to talk about political issues. I don't want to talk about political issues on X, on online, on Instagram, whatever. Even LinkedIn has become now a hotbed for polarization. Right. And it's just become a tuning out. And so hopefully starting conversations around the sensibilities of the exhausted majority and making those conversations compelling and making them about, universal things like truth and like progress and how to sort of achieve a moral consensus in a diverse society. Hopefully, right. I mean, I think that needs to be done at a very profound level and for a very long period of time for us to start seeing an improvement and kind of a marginalization of these marginalized extremes. They need to be marginalized. The problem is they're extremely passionate. They spend a tremendous amount of time. They are putting their careers, their names on the line for their issue that they believe in. So they take up a lot more room than probably they should.